pages 71 to 84. Family around her age, she needed special treatment. Mom decided Maureen needed to enroll in preschool with. She said she didn't want her youngest daughter dressed in the thrift store clothes the rest of us wore. Mom told us we would have to go shoplifting. Isn't that a sin? I asked Mom. Not exactly, Mom said. God doesn't mind you bending the rules a little if you have a good reason, sort of like justifiable homicide. This is justifiable pilfering. Mom's plan was for her and Maureen to go in the dressing room of the store with an armful of new clothes for Maureen to try on. When they came out, Mom would tell the clerk she didn't like any of the dresses. At that point, Lori Brown and I would create a ruckus to distract the clerk, while Mom hid a dress under a raincoat she would be carrying on her arm. We got 3 or 4 nice dresses from Maureen that way, but on one excursion, when Brian and I were pretending to punch each other out and Mom was in the process of slipping a dress under her raincoat, the sales lady turned to Mom and asked if she intended to buy the dress she was holding. Mom had no choice but to pay for it. $14 for a child's dress, she said as we left the store. It's highway robbery. Dad devised an ingenious way to come up with extra cash. He figured out that when you made a withdrawal from the drive-thru window at the bank, it took a few minutes for the transaction to register on the computer. So he would open a bank account, and a week or so later he would withdraw all the money from the teller inside the bank, while Mom withdrew the same amount from the drive-thru window. Lori said it sounded outright felonious, but Dad said all he was doing was outsmarting the fat cat bank owners who shylocked the common man by charging usurious interest rates. We're innocent expressions, Mom told us kids the first time we dropped off Dad in front of the bank. Will we have to go to a juvenile delinquent center if we get busted? I asked. Mom assured me it was all perfectly legal. People overdraw their accounts all the time, she said. If we get caught, we'll just pay a little overdraft fee. She explained that it was sort of like taking out a loan without all the messy paperwork. But as we drove up to the teller's window, Mom seemed to get edgy and giggled nervously as she passed the withdrawal slip through the bulletproof window. I think she was enjoying the thrill of taking from the rich. After the woman inside passed us the cash, Mom drove around the front of the bank. In a minute, Dad strolled out. He climbed in the front of the car, turned around, and with a wicked grin, held up a stack of bills and rifled them with his thumb. The reason Dad was having a tough time getting steady work, as he kept trying to tell us, was that the electricians' union in Phoenix was corrupt. It was run by the mob, he said, which controlled all the construction projects in the city. So before he could get a decent job, he had to run organized crime out of town. That required a lot of undercover research, and the best place to gather information was at the bars the mobsters owned. So Dad started spending most of his time in those joints. Mom rolled her eyes whenever Dad mentioned his research. I began to have my own doubts about what he was up to. He came home in such a drunken fury that Mom usually hid while we kids tried to calm him down. He broke windows, smashed dishes, furniture, until he spent all his anger. Then he'd look around at the mess and at us kids standing there. When he recognized what he'd done, he hung his head in weariness and shame. Then he'd sink to his knees and pitch forward face first on the floor. After Dad had collapsed, I would try to pick up the place, but Mom always made me stop. She'd been reading books on how to cope with an alcoholic, and they said that drunks don't remember their rampages, so if you cleaned up after them, they think nothing happened. Your father needs to see the mess he's making of our lives, Mom said, but when Dad got up, he'd act as if all the wreckage didn't exist and no one discussed it with him. The rest of us just had to get used to stepping over broken furniture and shattered glass. Mom had taught us to pick Dad's pocket when he passed out. We got pretty good at it. Once, after I rolled Dad and collected a handful of change, I pried his fingers loose for the bottle in his hand. It was 3/4 empty. I stared at the amber liquid. Mom never touched the stuff, and I wondered what Dad found so irresistible. I opened the bottle and sniffed. The awful smell stung my nose, but after working up my courage, I took a swig. It had a hideously thick taste, smoky, and so hot it burned my tongue. I ran to the bathroom, spat it out, and rinsed my mouth. I just took a swig of booze, I told Brian. It was the worst thing I ever tasted in my life. Brian grabbed the bottle out of my hand. He emptied it into the kitchen sink. Then he led me out into the shed and opened up a wooden trunk in the back marked Toy Box. It was filled with empty liquor bottles. Whenever Dad passed out, Brian said he took the bottle Dad had been drinking, emptied it, and hid it in the trunk. He'd wait until he had 10 or 12 and towed them to a garbage can a few blocks away because if Dad saw the empty bottles, he'd get furious. I have a really good feeling about this Christmas, Mom announced in early December. Lori pointed out the last few months hadn't gone so well. Exactly, Mom said. This is God's way of telling us to take charge of our own fates. God helps those who help themselves. She had such a good feeling that she decided this year we're going to celebrate Christmas on Christmas Day instead of a week later. Mom was an expert thrift store shopper. She read the labels on the clothes, turned over dishes and vases, to study the markings on the bottom. She had no qualms about telling the sales lady that a dress marked 25 cents was worth only a dime, and she usually got it at that price. Mom took us thrift store shopping for weeks before Christmas, giving us each $1 to spend on presents. I got a red glass bud vase for Mom, an onyx ashtray for Dad, a model car kit for Brian, a book about elves for Lori, and a stuffed tiger with a loose ear that Mom helped me sew back in place for Maureen. On Christmas morning, Mom took us down to a gas station that sold Christmas trees. She selected a tall, dark, but slightly dried out Douglas fir. "This poor old tree isn't going to sell by the end of the day, and it needs someone to love it," she told the man and offered him $3. The man looked at the tree and looked at Mom and looked at us kids. My dress had buttons missing. Holes were appearing along the seams of Maureen's t-shirt. "Lady, this one's been marked down to $1," he said. We carried the tree home and decorated it with Grandma's antique ornaments, ornate colored balls, fragile glass partridges, and lights with long tubes of bubbling water. I couldn't wait to open my presents, but Mom insisted we celebrate Christmas in the Catholic fashion, getting to the gifts only after we'd attended midnight mass. Dad, knowing that all the bars and liquor stores would be closed on Christmas, had stocked up in advance. He popped open the first Budweiser before breakfast, and by the time midnight mass rolled around, he was having trouble standing up. I suggested that maybe this once Mom should let Dad off the hook about going to mass, but she said stopping by God's house for a quick hello was especially important in times like this, so Dad staggered and lurched into the church with us. During the sermon, the priest discussed the miracle of the Immaculate Conception and the Virgin Birth. "Virgin, my ass," Dad shouted. "Mary was a sweet Jewish bride who got herself knocked up." The service came to a dead halt. Everyone was staring. The choir had swiveled around in unison, were gaping, open-mouthed. Even the priest was speechless. Dad had a satisfied grin on his face. "And Jesus H. Christ is the world's best-loved bastard." The ushers grimly escorted us to the street. On the way home, Dad put his arm around my shoulder for support. "Baby girl, if your boyfriend ever gets you into your panties and you find yourself in a family way, swear it was an immaculate conception and start mouthing off about miracles," he said. "Then just pass around the collection plate come Sunday." I didn't like Dad when he talked like that, and I tried to move away from him, but he just held me tighter. Back at home, we tried to calm Dad down. Mom gave him one of his presents, a brass cigarette lighter from the 1920s in the shape of a Scottish Terrier. Dad flicked it a couple times, swaying back and forth, and then he held it up to the light and studied it. "Let's really light up this Christmas," Dad said, and thrust the lighter into the Douglas fir. The dried-out needles caught fire immediately. Flames leaped through the branches with a crackling noise. Christmas ornaments exploded from the heat. For a few moments, we were too stunned to do anything. Mom called for blankets and water. We were able to put out the fire, but only by knocking down the tree, smashing most of the ornaments, and ruining all our presents. Dad sat on the sofa the whole time, laughing and telling Mom he was doing her a favor because the trees were pagan symbols of worship. Once the fire was out and the sodden, burned tree lay smoldering on the floor, we all just stood there. No one tried to wring Dad's neck or yell at him or even point out that he ruined the Christmas his family had spent weeks planning. The Christmas that was supposed to be the best we'd ever had. When Dad went crazy, we all had our own ways of shutting down and closing off, and that's what we did that night. I turned 10 that spring, but birthdays were not a big deal around our house. Sometimes Mom stuck a few candles and some ice cream, and we all sang happy birthday. Mom and Dad might get us a little present, a comic book or a pair of shoes or a package of underwear, but at least as often they forgot our birthdays altogether. So I was surprised when on the day I turned 10, Dad took me outside to the back patio and asked me what I wanted most in the world. "It's a special occasion, seeing as put you into double digits," he said. "You're growing up damn fast, Mountain Goat. You'll be on your own in no time, and if there's anything I can do for you now before you're gone, I want to do it." I knew Dad wasn't talking about buying me some extravagant present like a pony or a dollhouse. He was asking what he could do now that I was almost a grown-up to make my last years as a kid everything I hoped they'd be. There was only one thing I truly wanted, something I knew would change our lives, but I was afraid to ask for it. Just thinking about saying the words out loud made me nervous. Dad saw my hesitation. He knelt so that he was looking up at me. "What is it?" he said. "Ask away." "It's big. Just ask, baby." "I'm scared." If it's humanly possible, I'll get it for you. And if it ain't humanly possible, I'll die trying." I looked up at the thin swirls of clouds high in the blue Arizona sky. Keeping my eyes fastened on those distant clouds, I took a breath and said, "Do you think maybe you could stop drinking?" Dad said nothing. He was staring down at the cement patio, and when he turned to me, his eyes had a wounded look, like a dog who's been kicked. "You must be awfully ashamed of your old man," he said. "No," I said quickly. "It's just I think Mom would be a lot happier Plus, we'd have the extra money. You don't have to explain, Dad said. His voice was barely a whisper. He stood up and walked into the yard, but sat under the orange trees. I followed and sat down next to him. I was going to take his hand, but before I could reach for it, he said, "If you don't mind, honey, I think I'd like to sit here by myself for a while." In the morning, Dad told me that for the next few days, he was going to keep him to himself in his bedroom. He wanted us kids to steer clear of him, to stay outside all day and play. Everything went fine for the first day. On the second day, when I came home from school, I heard a terrible groaning coming from the bedroom. "Dad?" I called. There was no answer. I opened the door. Dad was tied to the bed with ropes and belts. I didn't know if he had done it himself or if Mom helped him, but he was thrashing about, bucking and pulling at the restraints, yelling, "No! Stop! And oh my God!" His face was gray and dripping with sweat. I called out to him again, but he didn't see or hear me. I went into the kitchen and filled an empty orange juice jug with water. I sat with the jug next to Dad's door in case he got thirsty. Mom saw me and told me to go outside and play. I told her I wanted to help Dad. She said there was nothing I could do, but I stayed by the door anyway. Dad's delirium continued for days. When I came home from school, I'd get the jug of water, take up my position by the door, and wait there till bedtime. Brian and Maureen played outside, and Lori kept to the far side of the house. Mom painted in her studio. No one talked much about what was going on. One night we were eating dinner. Dad let out a particularly hideous cry. I looked at Mom, who was stirring her soup, as if it were an ordinary evening, and that was when I lost it. "Do something," I yelled at her. "You gotta do something to help Dad." "Your father's the only one who can help himself," Mom said. "Only he knows how to fight his own demons." After the better part of a week, Dad's delirium stopped, and he asked us to come talk to him in the bedroom. He was propped up on the pillow, paler and thinner than I'd ever seen him. He took the water jug I offered him. His hands were shaking so badly he had trouble holding it, and water dribbled down his chin as he drank. A few days later, Dad was able to walk around, but he had no appetite, and his hands still trembled. I told Mom that maybe I had made a terrible mistake, but Mom said sometimes you have to get sicker before you can get better. Within a few more days, Dad seemed almost normal, except that he'd become tentative, even kind of shy. He smiled at us kids a lot and squeezed our shoulders, sometimes leaning on us to steady himself. "I wonder what life will be like now," I said to Lori. "The same," she said. He tried stopping before. It never lasted. This time it will. How do you know? It's his present to me. Dad spent his summer recuperating. For days on end, he'd sit under the orange trees reading. By early fall, he'd recovered most of his strength. To celebrate his new life on the wagon and to put some distance between himself and his drinking haunts, he decided that the Walls clan should take a long camping trip to the Grand Canyon. We'd avoid the park rangers, find a cave somewhere along the river. We'd swim and fish and cook or catch over an open fire. Mom and Lori could paint. Dad and Brian and I could climb the cliffs and study the canyon's geological strata. It'd be like the old times. We kids didn't need to be going to school, he said. He and Mom could instruct us better than any of those shit-for-brains teachers. You, Mountain Goat, can put together a rock collection, the likes of which has never been seen. Dad told me. Everyone loved the idea. Brian and I were so excited we did a jig right there on the living room floor. We packed blankets, food, canteens, fishing line, the lavender blanket Maureen took everywhere, Lori's papers and pencils, Mom's easel and the canvases and the brushes and paints. What couldn't fit in the trunk of the car we tied to the top. We also took along Mom's fancy archery set, the one made of inlaid fruit wood, because Dad said you never know what wild game we might find in those canyon recesses. He promised Brian and me that we'd be shooting that bow and arrow like a couple of full-blooded Indian kids by the time we came back, if we ever came back. Hell, we might decide to live in the Grand Canyon permanently. We started out early the next morning. Once we got north of Phoenix, past all the tract house suburbs, the traffic thinned and Dad started going faster and faster. There ain't no better feeling than being on the move, he said. We were out in the desert now, the telephone poles snapping past. "Hey, Mountain Goat," he hollered. "How fast do you think I can make this car go?" "Faster than the speed of light," I said. I leaned over the front seat and watched the needle and the speedometer creep up. We were doing 90 miles an hour. "You're going to see that little needle go all the way off the dial," Dad said. I could see his leg move as he stepped on the gas. We rolled down the windows and maps and art paper and cigarette ashes were whipping around our heads. The speedometer needle crept past 100, the last number on the dial, and pushed into the empty space beyond. The car started shuddering, but Dad didn't let up on the accelerator. Mom covered her head with her arms and told Dad to slow down, but that only made him press on the gas even harder. Suddenly, there was a clattering noise under the car. I looked back to make sure no important part had fallen off and saw a cone of gray smoke billowing behind us. Just then, the white steam that smelled like iron started pouring out from the sides of the hood and blowing past the windows. The shuddering increased, and with a terrible coughing, clunking noise, the car began to slow down. Soon it was going at no more than a crawl. Then the engine died altogether. We coasted for a few yards in silence before the car stopped. "Now you've done it," Mom said. We kids and Dad got out and pushed the car to the side of the road while Mom steered. Dad lifted the hood, and I watched while he and Brian studied the smoking, grease-encrusted engine and discussed the parts by name. Then I went to sit in the car with Mom, Lori, and Maureen. Lori gave me a disgusted look, as if she thought it was my fault the car had broken down. "Why do you always encourage him?" she asked. "Don't worry," I said. "Dad'll fix it." We sat there for a long time. I could see buzzards circling high in the distance, which reminded me of that ingrate, Buster. Maybe I should have cut him some slack. With his broken wing and lifetime of eating roadkill, he probably had a lot to be ungrateful about. Too much hard luck can create a permanent meanness of spirit in a creature. Finally, Dad shut the hood. "You can fix it, can't you?" I asked. "Of course," he said, "if I had the proper tools." We'd have to temporarily postpone our expedition to the Grand Canyon, he told us. Our first priority now is to head back to Phoenix so he could get his hands on the right tools. "How?" Lori asked. "Hitchhiking was one option," Dad said, "but it might be hard finding a car with enough room to accommodate 4 kids and 2 adults, since we were all so athletic, and since none of us were whiners, walking home would be no problem." "It's almost 80 miles, Lori said. "That's right," Dad said. "If we covered 3 miles an hour for 8 hours a day, we could make it 3 days. We had to leave everything behind except Maureen's lavender blanket and the canteens. That included Mom's fruitwood archery set. Since Mom was attached to that archery set, which her father had given her, Dad had Brian and me hide it in an irrigation ditch. We'd come back and retrieve it later. Dad carried Maureen. To keep our spirits up, he called "Hup, 2, 3, 4," but Mom and Lori refused to march along in step. Eventually, Dad gave up, and it was quiet except for the sound of our feet crunching on the sand and rocks, and the wind whipping off the desert. After walking for what seemed like a couple of hours, we reached a motel billboard that we had passed only a minute or so before the car broke down. The occasional car was by, and Dad stuck out his thumb, but none of them stopped. Around midday, a big blue Buick with gleaming chrome bumpers slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder in front of us. A lady with a beauty parlor hairdo rolled down the window. "You poor people," she exclaimed. "Are you okay?" She asked us where we were going. We told her Phoenix. She offered us a ride. The air conditioning in the Buick was so cold that goosebumps popped up on my arms and legs. The lady had Lori and me pass around Coca-Colas and sandwiches from a cooler in the footwell. Dad said he wasn't hungry. The lady kept talking about how her daughter had been driving down the highway and seen us, and when she got to the lady's house, had told her about this poor family walking along the side of the road. And I said to my daughter, "Why, I can't leave these poor people out there." I told my daughter, "Those poor kids must be dying of thirst, poor things." "We're not poor," I said. She had used that word one too many times. "Of course you're not," the lady quickly replied. I didn't mean it that way." But I could tell she had. The lady grew quiet, and for the rest of the trip, no one said much. As soon as she dropped us off, Dad disappeared. I waited on the front steps until bedtime, but he didn't come home. 3 days later, when Lori and I were sitting at Grandma's old upright piano trying to teach each other to play, we heard heavy, uneven footsteps at the front door. We turned and saw Dad. He tripped on the coffee table. When we tried to help him, he cursed and lurched at us, swinging his fists. He wanted to know where that goddamn sorry-ass mother of ours was, and he got so mad we didn't tell him that he pulled over Grandma's china closet, sending her fine bone china crashing to the floor. Brian came running in. He tried to grab Dad's leg, but Dad kicked him off. Dad yanked out the silverware drawer and hurled the forks and spoons and knives across the room, then picked up one of the chairs and smashed it on Grandma's table. "Rosemary, where the goddamn hell are you, stinking bee?" he yelled. "Where's that W hiding?" He found Mom in the bathroom, crouched in the tub. As she darted past him, he grabbed her dress, and she started flailing. They started their way into the dining room. He knocked her to the floor. She reached into the pile of kitchen utensils that Dad had thrown there, grabbed a butcher knife, and slashed it through the air in front of him. Dad leaned back. "A knife fight, eh?" He grinned. "Okay, if that's what you want." He picked up a knife, too, tossing it from hand to hand. Then he knocked the knife out of Mom's hand, dropped his own knife, and wrestled her to the floor. We kids pounded on Dad's back and begged him to stop, but he ignored us. At last, he pinned Mom's hands behind her head. "Rosemary, you're one hell of a woman," Dad said, and Mom told him he was a stinking rotten drunk. "Yeah, but you love this old drunk, don't you?" Dad said. Mom at first said no, she didn't, but Dad kept asking her again and again, and when she finally said yes, the fight disappeared from both of them, vanished as if it never existed. Dad started laughing and hugging Mom, who was laughing and hugging him. It was as if they were so happy they hadn't killed each other that and that they had fallen in love with each other all over again. I didn't feel like celebrating. After all he put himself through, I couldn't believe Dad had just gone back to the booze. With Dad drinking again and no money coming in, Mom began to talk about moving east to West Virginia where Dad's parents lived. Maybe his parents would help him keep him in line. If nothing else, they could help out financially, like Grandma Smith had done from time to time. We'd love it in West Virginia, she told us. We live in the forest, in the mountains with the squirrels, the chipmunks. You can meet our Grandma and Grandpa Walls, who were genuine hillbillies. Mom made living in West Virginia sound like another great adventure, and pretty soon all his kids had signed up for the trip. Dad hated the idea, however, and refused to help Mom, so she plotted on her own. Since we'd never retrieved the car or any of our stuff from the failed Grand Canyon expedition, the first thing Mom needed was a set of wheels. She said that God works in mysterious ways, and it just so happened that she had inherited some land in Texas when Grandma died. She waited until she received a check for several $100s from the company that was leasing the drilling rights. Then she went to buy a used car. A local radio station had promotional broadcast once a week for a car lot that we passed on our way to school. Every Wednesday, the DJs and the used car salesmen would rave on air about incredible deals and the lowest prices around. To prove their point, they'd announce the piggy bank special, some car priced under $1,000 that they'd sell the first lucky caller. Mom set her sights on a piggy bank special. She wasn't taking any chances on being the first caller. She went down with her cash, sat in the dealership office while we kids waited on a park bench across the street listening to the broadcast on the transistor radio. The piggy bank special that Wednesday was a 1956 Oldsmobile, which Mom bought for $200. We listened as she took to the airwaves to tell the radio audience she knew a heck of a bargain when she saw one. Mom was not allowed to test drive the piggy bank special before buying it. The car lurched and stalled several times on the way home. It was impossible to tell whether it was Mom's driving or whether we bought a lemon. We kids were not all that thrilled about the idea of Mom driving us cross country. She didn't have a valid driver's license, for one thing, and she'd always been a terrible driver. If Dad got too drunk, she ended up being behind the wheel. But cars never seemed to run right from home. Once, we were driving through downtown Phoenix, and she couldn't get the brakes to work. And she had Brian and me stick our heads out the windows and scream, "No brakes, no brakes," as we rolled through intersections, and she looked for something relatively soft to crash into. We ended up plowing into a dumpster behind the supermarket and walking home. Mom said that anyone critical of her driving could help with the task. Now that we had a car, she continued, we could leave the next morning. It was October and we'd been in school for just over a month, but Mom said we had no time to tell our teachers we were withdrawing or to get any of our school records. When we enrolled in West Virginia, she vouched for her scholastic achievement, and once our new teachers had heard us read, they realized we were all gifted. Dad was still refusing to come with us. When we left, he said he was going to head out into the desert on his own to become a prospector. I asked Mom if we were going to sell the house on North 3rd Street or rent it out. Neither. She said it's my house. She explained that it was nice to own something for a change and saw no point in selling it just because we were moving. She didn't want to rent it either because she was opposed to anyone else living in the house. We'd leave it as it was. To prevent burglars and vandals from breaking in, we'd hang laundry on the clothesline, put dirty dishes in the sink. That way, Mom pointed out our potential intruders would think the house was occupied and would be fooled into believing that the people who lived there might come home any second. The following morning, we packed up the car while Dad sat in the living room sulking. We tied Mom's art supplies to the roof and filled the trunk with pots and pans and blankets. Mom had bought each of us a warm coat at a thrift store so we had something to wear in West Virginia, where it got so cold in the winter it snowed. Mom said we could each take one thing, like the time we left Battle Mountain. I wanted to bring my bike, but Mom said it was too big, so I brought my geode. I ran into the backyard and said goodbye to the orange trees, and then I ran out front to get in the Oldsmobile. I had to crawl over Brian and sit in the middle because he and Lori had already staked out the window seats. Maureen was in the front seat with Mom, who had started the engine and was practicing her gear shifts. Dad was still in the house, so I leaned over Brian and shouted at the top of my voice. Dad appeared in the doorway, his arms folded across his chest. "Dad, please come. We need you," I hollered. Lori and Brian and Mom and Maureen all chimed in. "We need you." We shouted, "You're the head of the family. You're the dad. Come on." Dad stood there looking at us for a minute. Then he flicked the cigarette he was smoking into the yard, closed the front door, loped over to the car and told Mom to move aside. He was driving. Chapter 3, Welch. Back in Battle Mountain, we'd stopped naming the Walls family cars because they were all such heaps that Dad said they didn't deserve names. Mom said that when she was growing up on the ranch, they never named the cattle because they knew it would have to kill them. If we didn't name the car, we didn't have to feel sad when we had to abandon it. So the piggy bank special was just the Oldsmobile. We never said the name with any fondness or even pity. That Oldsmobile was a clunker from the moment we bought it. The first time it conked out, we were still an hour shy of the New Mexico border. Dad stuck his head under the hood, tinkered with the engine, got it going, but it broke down again a couple of hours later. Dad got it running. More like limping, he said, but it never went any faster than 15 or 20 miles an hour. Also, the hood kept popping up, so we had to tie it down with a rope. We steered clear of toll booths by taking 2-lane back roads, where we usually had a long line of drivers behind us, honking in exasperation. When one of the Oldsmobile's windows stopped rolling up in Oklahoma, we taped garbage bags over it. We slept in the car every night, and after arriving late in Muskogee and parking on an empty downtown street, we woke up to find a bunch of people surrounding the car, little kids pressing their nose against the windows and grown-ups shaking their heads and grinning. Mom waved at the crowd. "You know, you're down and out when Okies laugh at you," she said with our garbage bag taped window, our rope-down hood, and the art supplies tied to the roof. We'd out Okie the Okies. The thought gave her a fit of the giggles. I pulled a blanket over my head and refused to come out until we were beyond the Muskogee city limits. Life is a drama, full of tragedy and comedy. Mom told me, "You should learn to enjoy the comic episodes a little more." It took us a month to cross the country. We might as well have been traveling in a Conestoga wagon. Mom also kept insisting that we make scenic detours to broaden our horizons. We drove down to see the Alamo. Davy Crockett, James Bowie got what was coming to them, Mom said, for stealing this land from the Mexicans, and over to Beaumont, where the oil rigs bobbed like giant birds. In Louisiana, Mom had us climb up on the roof of the car and pull down the tufts of Spanish moss hanging from the tree branches. After crossing the Mississippi, we swung north toward Kentucky, then east. Instead of the flat desert edged by craggy mountains, the land rolled and dipped like a sheet when you shook it clean. Finally, we entered the hill country, climbing higher and deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, stopping from time to time to let the Oldsmobile catch its breath on the steep, twisting roads. It was November. The leaves had turned brown and were falling from the trees, and a cold mist shrouded the hillsides. There were streams and creeks everywhere instead of the irrigation ditches you saw out west, and the air felt different. It was very still, heavier and thicker, and somehow darker. For some reason, it made us all grow quiet. At dusk, we approached a bend where hand-painted signs advertising auto repairs and coal deliveries had been nailed down to trees along the roadside. We rounded the bend, found ourselves in a deep valley. Wooden houses and small brick buildings lined the river in rows and uneven stacks on both hillsides. "Welcome to Welch," Mom declared. We drove along dark, narrow streets, and then stopped in front of a big, worn house. It was on the downhill side of a street. We had to descend a set of stairs to get to it. As we clattered onto the porch, a woman opened the door. She was enormous, with pasty skin and about 3 chins. Bobby pins held back her lank gray hair, and a cigarette dangled from her mouth. "Welcome home, son," she said, and gave Dad a long hug. She turned to Mom. "Nice of you to let me see my grandchildren before I die," she said without a smile, without taking the cigarette out of her mouth. She gave us each a quick, stiff hug. Her cheek was tacky with sweat. "Pleased to meet you, Grandma." I said. "Don't call me Grandma," she snapped. "Name's Irma." "She don't like it none because it makes her sound old," said a man who appeared beside her. He looked fragile with short white hair that stood straight up. His voice was so mumbly I could hardly understand him. I didn't know if it was his accent or maybe he wasn't wearing his dentures. "Name's Ted, but you can call me Grandpa," he went on. "Don't bother me none being a grandpa." Behind Grandpa was a ruddy-faced man with a wild swirl of red hair pushing down from under his baseball cap, which had a Maytag logo. He wore a red and black plaid coat, but had no shirt on underneath. He kept announcing over and over again that he was our Uncle Stanley, and he wouldn't stop hugging and kissing me, as though I was someone he truly loved and hadn't seen in ages. You could smell the whiskey on his breath, and when he talked, you could see the pink ridges of his toothless gums. I stared at Irma and Stanley and Grandpa, searching for some feature that reminded me of Dad, but I saw none. Maybe this was one of Dad's pranks, I thought. Dad must have arranged for the weirdest people in town to pretend they were his family. In a few minutes, he'd start laughing and telling us where his real parents lived. We'd go there, and a smiling woman with perfumed hair would welcome us and feed us steaming bowls of cream of wheat. I looked at Dad. He wasn't smiling. He kept pulling at the skin of his neck as if he were itchy. We followed Irma and Stanley and Grandpa inside. It was cold in the house, and the air smelled of mold and cigarettes and unwashed laundry. We huddled around a pot-bellied cast iron coal stove in the middle of the living room, held out her hands to warm them. Irma pulled a bottle of whiskey from the pocket of her house dress, and Dad looked happy for the first time since we left Phoenix. Irma ushered us into the kitchen where she was fixing dinner. A bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting harsh light on the yellow walls, which were coated with a thin film of grease. Irma stuck a curved steel handle into the iron disc on top of an old coal cooking stove, lifted it, and with her other hand grabbed a poker from the wall and jabbed at the hot orange coals inside. She stirred a pot full of green beans, stewing in fat back, and poured in a big handful of salt. Then she set a tray of Pillsbury biscuits on the kitchen table and ladled out a plate of beans for each of the kids. The beans were so overcooked they fell apart when I stuck my fork in them, and it's so salty I could barely force myself to swallow. I pinched my nose closed, which is the way Mom had taught us to down things that had gone a little bit rotten. Irma saw me and slapped my hand away. "Beggars can't be choosers," she said. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, Irma said, but no one had been to the second floor in nigh on 10 years because the floorboards were rotted through. Uncle Stanley volunteered to give us his room in the basement and sleep on a cot in the foyer while we were there. "We'll only be staying a few days," Dad said, "until we find a place of our own." After dinner, Mom and us kids were down in the basement. It was a big, dank room with cinder block walls and a green linoleum floor. There was another coal stove, a bed, a pull-out couch where Mom and Dad could sleep, and a chest of drawers painted fire engine red. It held hundreds of dog-eared comic books, Little Lulu, Richie Rich, Beetle Bailey, Archie and Jughead, that Uncle Stanley had collected over the years. Under the chest of drawers were jugs of genuine moonshine. We kids climbed into Stanley's bed. To make it less crowded, Lori and I lay down with our heads at one end, and Brian and Maureen lay with theirs at the other. Brian's feet were in my face, so I grabbed him by the ankles and started chewing on his toes. He laughed and kicked and started chewing on my toes in retaliation, and that made me laugh. We heard a loud thunk, thunk, thunk from above. "What's that?" Lori asked. "Maybe the roaches here are bigger than in Phoenix," Brian said. We all laughed and heard the thunk, thunk, thunk again. Mom went upstairs to investigate, then came down and explained that Irma was hitting the floor with a broom handle to signal that we were making too much noise. "She asked you kids don't laugh while you're in her house," Mom said. "It gets on her nerves." "I don't think Irma likes us very much," I said. "She's just an old woman who's had a tough life," Mom said. "They're all so weird." "We'll adapt," Mom said, "or move on," I thought. The next day was Sunday. When we got up, Uncle Stanley was leaning against the refrigerator and staring intently at the radio. It made strange noises, not static, but a combination of shrieking and wailing. "That there's tongues," he said. "Only the Lord can understand it." The preacher started talking actual English, more or less. He spoke with a hillbilly accent, so thick it was almost hard to understand as the tongues. He asked all them good folk out there who'd been helped by this here channeling the Lord's Spirit to send contributions. Dad came into the kitchen and listened. It's the sort of soul-curdling voodoo, he said, that turned me into an atheist. Later that day, we got into the Oldsmobile, and Mom and Dad took us for a tour of the town. Welch was surrounded on all sides by such steep mountains you felt like you were looking up from the bottom of a bowl. Dad said the hills around Welch were too steep for cultivating much of anything. Couldn't raise a decent herd of sheep or cattle. Couldn't even till crops, except maybe to feed your family. So this part of the world was left pretty much alone until the turn of the century, when robber barons from the north laid a track into the area and brought in cheap labor to dig out huge fields of coal. We stopped under a railroad bridge and got out of the car to admire the river that ran through the town. It moved sluggishly with barely a ripple. The river's name, Dad said, was the Tug. "Maybe in the summer we can go fishing and swimming," I said. Dad shook his head. The county had no sewer system, he explained, so when people flushed the Johns, the discharge went straight into the Tug. Sometimes the river flooded and the water rose as high as the treetops. Dad pointed to the toilet paper up in the branches along the riverbanks. The Tug, he said, had the highest level of fecal bacteria of any river in North America. "What's fecal?" I asked. Dad watched the river. "Shit," he said. Dad led us along the main road through the towns. It was narrow with old brick buildings crowding in close on both sides. The stores, the signs, the sidewalks, the cars were all covered with a film of black coal dust, giving the town almost a monochromatic look, like an old hand-tinted photograph. Welch was shabby and worn out, but you could tell it had once been a place on its way up. On a hill stood a grand limestone courthouse with a big clock tower. Across from it was a handsome bank with arched windows and a wrought iron door. You could also tell the people of Welch were trying to maintain some pride of place. A sign near the town's only stoplight announced that Welch was the county seat of McDowell County, and that for years more coal had been mined in McDowell County than any comparable spot in the world. Next to it, another sign boasted that Welch had the largest outdoor municipal parking lot in North America. But the cheerful advertisements painted on the sides of the buildings like the TikTok Diner and the Pocahontas movie theater were faded, nearly illegible. Dad said that bad times had come in the 50s. They hit hard and stayed. President JFK had come to Welch not long after he was elected and personally handed out the nation's first food stamps on here on McDowell Street. To prove his point that though ordinary Americans might find it hard to believe, starvation-level poverty existed right in our own country. The road through Welch, Dad told us, led only farther up into the wet, forbidding mountains and on to other dying coal towns. Few strangers passed through Welch these days. Almost all who did came to inflict some form of misery or another, to lay off workers, to shut down a mine, to foreclose on someone's house, to compete for the rare job opening. The townspeople didn't care much for outsiders. The streets were mostly silent and deserted on that morning, but every now and then we'd pass a woman wearing curlers or a group of men in t-shirts with motor oil decals, loitering in a doorway. I tried to catch their eyes, to give them a nod, and smiled and let them know we'd only had good intentions, but they never nodded or spoke a word or even glanced our way. As soon as we passed over, I could feel eyes following us up the street. Dad had brought Mom to Welch for a brief visit 15 years earlier, right after they were married.